Hello, I'm Nick Clark. This is Counting the Cost on Al Jazeera, your weekly look at the world of business and economics. This week, global military spending is at an all-time high, increasing in all 5 geographical regions. So why are nations racing to replenish their stockpiles? As tensions escalate in the Middle East, Western nations impose a new round of sanctions against Iran. Will that impact the nation's ability to wage a war? Threatened by an excess of tourists, Italy's ancient city of Venice is now charging entry fees. But will it help protect the UNESCO World Heritage Site? So Russia's invasion of Ukraine, escalating geopolitical tensions in the Middle East, and China's military build-up in the South China Sea. The world is now facing a period of increased instability. Nations right across the globe are boosting their defences. Military spending reached an all-time high of nearly $2.4 trillion last year. And the Stockholm International Peace Research Institute, that's SIPRI, says for the first time in 15 years, the increase is spread right across all 5 geographical regions. So let's take a look at it. The top 5 spenders, respectively, were the US, China, Russia, India, and Saudi Arabia. Now, China boosted spending on its military for the 29th straight year, raising it to an estimated $296 billion. Beijing's military build-up and worsening tensions in the region also prompted its neighbours to dedicate more funds to their militaries. And the Middle East saw the highest growth rate in a decade, with Saudi Arabia its top spender. The kingdom is followed by Israel, which has increased its expenditure to $27.5 billion. This spending surge mainly driven by Israel's war on Gaza. While the war in Ukraine was the main driver of European defence spending, and Russia's military expenditure, it surged to around $109 billion. By comparison, Ukraine has the 8th largest military budget at $65 billion and receives military aid from more than 30 countries. Among them is the United States, which has committed to $95 billion in foreign aid for Ukraine, for Israel, and for other US allies.
These are not normal times, they're not. The world is destabilized and it's a tinderbox. It's a dangerous time. 3 of our primary adversaries, Russia and Iran and China, are working together, and they're being aggressors around the globe. And they're a global threat to our prosperity and our security. Their advance threatens the free world, and it demands American leadership. If we turn our backs right now, the consequences could be devastating.
Well, joining us now from London is Po Freeman. He's a research coordinator at a campaign against arms trade. He previously worked for 9 years at SIPRI. Sam, welcome to Counting the Cost. So this report might not have come as a surprise, but what's different about it, and what are the main drivers, would you say, of military spending in 2023?
Well, it's one of the largest increases in global military spending in real terms in quite a long time, a 6.8% increase, a lot bigger increase than most previous years. The last time that military spending increased that much was 2009. And if you remember, that was a year just after the global financial crisis had struck. And at that time, most major economies, US, China, most of the European economies, were putting in place stimulus packages, massive spending packages, including very often increased military spending to counter the effects of the recession. So that was a very unusual year, and this is the largest increase since then. And the previous largest increase was 2003, the year the Iraq War started. So it's very much a wartime year, a level of spending. And the Ukraine war continues to be the big driver of the increase in world military spending.
Would you say that overall armament is spiralling out of control? Are there enough arms agreements in place to try and stop it happening?
I fear so, that yes, that it is spiraling out of control. And as for arms control agreements, there's very little that's left. The conventional forces in Europe treaty, Russia's pulled out, NATO's pulled out, that's basically gone. The New START has lapsed. All countries are looking at increasing their nuclear arsenals, modernizing them. The US is talking about bringing intermediate range cruise missiles, nuclear weapons back to Europe, which could be a very dangerous development. In the Asia Pacific, where the US and China are engaged in a long-running arms race, there are no arms control agreements, conventional arms control agreements, and there's not even been any attempt to make such agreements.
So now Israel is accused of carrying out a genocide in Gaza. How can humanitarian laws be protected while nations race to arm themselves?
Yeah, well, unfortunately, when countries go to war, the international humanitarian law very often goes out the window, especially when the countries that are supporting them and arming them, as is the case of the US, Germany, UK with Israel, fail to hold them to account. The evidence that Israel is committing war crimes, even genocide in Gaza, is overwhelming. The US and European countries all have laws that should stop arms sales to countries that are doing such things. Yet they are pretending not to see, for their own strategic or political reasons. They are pretending not to see this and saying, no, everything is fine, it's all self-defense. And it was the same when Saudi Arabia was bombing Yemen, though now the civilian death toll from that bombing, it was very bad. It pales in comparison to what's happening now in Gaza. But the US and the UK and others continued to make excuses for Saudi Arabia, despite the fact that it was repeatedly bombing civilians. Of course, Russia in Ukraine has barely made any pretense to be following international law. Unfortunately, humanitarian considerations seem to take not even second place, fourth or fifth place when countries go to war.
And the US pushing to end the war on Gaza while still supplying weapons, it's just double standards, isn't it?
I don't think they're really pushing to end the war in Gaza. They are making a show. They are using rhetoric that they want to see an end to the war. They have the leverage. If they were to stop supplying the arms, the munitions, the spare parts, the war could not go on. They are not putting even any conditions on this aid and on these arms. I think that the Biden administration wants to appear to the world, to a part of the electorate, that they're trying to end the war. In reality, there is no serious, meaningful effort to bring it to an end. If the US really wanted the war to end, the war would end.
Right. And as we look forward into the coming months and years, do you think this upward trend in armament will continue?
Unfortunately, yes. European countries are still rapidly increasing their military spending. A lot of them are still well below the NATO target of 2%, and they're pledged to get there or even higher. The UK has just pledged to reach 2.5% of GDP by 2030, which would be another large increase. That's the probably outgoing Tory government, but a Labour government is likely to follow exactly the same policy. Over half of the increase in world military spending last year was in Europe. So that trend is likely to continue. Of course, at some point, the immediate Russia-Ukraine war will presumably come to an end, though how long that is, we've no idea. And that might reduce some of the pressure, but it will still be an extremely tense and hostile situation in Europe. And as I say, at the other end of the world, the US-China arms race in the Asia Pacific shows no signs of letting up. And fortunately, there doesn't seem to be any near-term threat of that turning into a hot war, God willing, but the competition for military hegemony in the region and therefore the increases in spending are likely to continue.
All right, we'll leave it there. Sam Po Freeman, thanks very much.
Thank you very much for having me.
Now, tit-for-tat attacks between Iran and Israel have raised fears of a wider war in the Middle East. The US and its allies have imposed more sanctions on Tehran, hoping to limit its ability to attack Israel again. The measures could deprive Iran of billions of dollars in revenues, but Iran says its economy is resilient. Recent data, in fact, shows it's exported more oil in the first 3 months of the year than at any time in the past 6 years. But many Iranians say that they're struggling. Veronica Pedrosa has this report now.
On April the 13th, Iran launched hundreds of missiles and drones towards Israel. It was the single largest drone strike carried out by any country, and the first time Iran directly attacked Israel. Iranian officials say it was retaliation for Israel's assault on the consulate in Damascus on April the 1st.
Our forces punished the Zionist regime and put it in its place. And this was an announcement to the whole world, to global powers, to the Zionist regime, that the nation of Iran is ready.
Israel then hit back, striking Iranian targets. And its closest allies, the US, EU and the UK, were quick to impose fresh economic sanctions on Iran and its weapons manufacturers. Washington says Tehran must be held accountable and prevented from acting again. The country has been under Western sanctions for years, but the government says they've had little impact on oil exports, with more than 90% of its crude shipped to China. Still, Iran's economy is suffering from weak growth. In February, inflation hit 40%. Prices of some food items, such as meat, had almost tripled compared with the same month last year.
There's been a rise in prices, especially dairy products. Sanctions have impacts. When a country is isolated, pressure on its people gets more, and a specific class of the society feels it more than others. 100%, if tensions are escalated, prices will rise more and more.
The price of beans, chicken, meat, all the food, it's increased by double. Further sanctions and escalations will have impact on people's livelihoods. People here are worried about it.
As tensions linger, can Iran's economy withstand the consequences of a full-scale war with Israel? Veronica Pedrosa, Al Jazeera, for Counting the Cost.
Well, joining us now from Berlin is Mohammad Reza Farzanagan. He is a professor of economics of the Middle East at Philipps Universitat Marburg. Mohammed, welcome. First up, what do you make of this new round of sanctions against Iran?
The new round of sanctions, which is recently decided in the U.S. government after Iran and Israel conflict, is aiming to basically restrict even further Iranian oil exports, especially to the Chinese customers. However, as you also showed in your report, China very much benefiting from receiving oil from Iran and other sanctioned countries such as Russia. They save billions of dollars on discounts. And much of these oil exported to China are not through the official channels. The so-called dark fleet or dark shipping lines basically are engaged. They're part of the shadow economy of trade of oil, and it is quite difficult for the U.S. government to trace these basically informal trading of oil between Iran and China. And from technical perspective, one can say there are significant, substantial costs in that, and expected benefits of these new round of the sanctions also unclear, depending on the goals of the senders of the sanctions. It is to change the behavior of Iranian government. The previous round of sanctions showed that basically they are counterproductive, and that makes Iranian government more willing maybe to also engage in the conflict, the more sanction imposed on this country.
So given that Iran seems to be able to circumvent the sanctions and increase its oil exports, do you think the Biden administration will go to further sanctioning?
Well, I mean, we are in the election year in U.S., and one should basically also, I'm sure that in the U.S. administration, there would be a cost-benefit analysis, an expected cost of increasing additional sanction on Iran, especially on oil industry, which is also affecting the Chinese economic growth, would also result to more political tension between China and U.S. on one side. On the other side, it could also add a positive increasing shock to the oil markets, which at the end, the cost would be transferred to the U.S. consumers. And in this election year, which U.S. Basically will face competition between Biden and Trump, this is a very central issue. The inflation rate, the growing inflation rate, or gasoline prices in the U.S. would be a very crucial factor. So I would believe that given the current condition, the enforcing of these new round of the sanction is quite less likely, in my view.
Okay, so when Iran says it's managed to shield itself from the sanctions and is resilient, its economy is resilient, do you think that's totally true across the board?
Well, Iran has shown that basically survived the painful sanctions. When we look at the Obama sanction 2012 and up to the GCPOA, and after that reimposition of sanctions, the Trump on Iran, we do see immediate negative effects on Iranian economy. Of course, GDP gross domestic production has declined significantly within the first 2 years of the sanction, but then recovered slowly. So the Iranian situation is like a person with a significant back pain, which basically the body try to adjust itself to this sickness.
Right.
So at the end, the welfare situation has reduced, but the economic has shown some significant resistance.
Okay, so the economy is resilient. What about from the point of view of the man and woman in the streets? How are they affected by these sanctions?
That's true. I mean, when we talk about the economic cost of the sanction, one should separate the short-term effects, middle-term effects, and long-term effects. We have seen that the short-term effects is obviously visible in the negative growth rate. Recovery has started in the years after the sanctions imposed on Iran because the new ways of doing business as identified by the Iranian government. However, still Iranian economy is in a bad equilibrium compared to the pre-sanction period. So inflation also has been reported to has increased substantially. When we look at the 10% inflation rate before Obama sanction, now it is more than 40%. Devaluation of Iranian currency has also made much of the imports much more expensive, transferred to the consumer prices. The higher prices will be paid by the Iranians in the market. So all these factors increase the economic uncertainty in the middle term. In the long term, of course, the cost would be much more substantial because we need to take into account the effects of sanctions on education, on health, on environment, on the loss of human capital in Iran to this out-migration that we are observing. So in that sense, the net effect of sanctions is something negative, right? And this is something that the people also realize in the daily life. But the question whether that has resulted to substantial change in Iranian behavior, we cannot trace that in a substantial way. So the political behavior has not changed much under the sanctions, and the government has found a way to bypass the sanctions.
What impact do the sanctions and any potential sanctions in the future have on Iran's ability to wage war, do you think?
Initiating and financing the war, of course, is an issue that we don't see that in the Iranian agenda. So to initiate a war, but if your question is about, funding kind of military adventures in the regions, that's very much depends on the domestic and external factor. And domestic situation, we are under sanctions still, and the finance available to basically fund a military operation is quite limited. There is an additional pressure on the government to increase the taxes. in order to cover some part of this budget deficit under the sanctions. So economic indicators are not showing that the country is ready for or is able for long-term military kind of conflict with specific neighbors in the region. On the other side, one basically needs a kind of mass mobilization in Iran for these type of activities. The years under the sanction has resulted in mismanagement. This is also something that one should acknowledge, that the sanction is one factor, but the quality of governance and mismanagement in Iran is another factor, and both of them are important. So this mass mobilization of Iranians to support this type of activities has also degraded over the recent years. We are talking about the trust between the civil society and the formal institutions. That has been weakened, especially after the protests of 2022 under the Women Life Freedom. And all these factors basically indicate that the situation to initiate such adventures is not available.
Okay, appreciate your analysis, Mohammad Reza Fazanagan. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Now then, it is a UNESCO World Heritage Site and more than 30 million tourists come each year. And most visitors to the floating city of Venice in Italy are there just for the day. Many residents are now complaining about pollution and rising rents fueled by the excess of tourists. Well, now Venice has become the world's first city to charge day trippers around $5 entry to try and curb over-tourism. The payment system is now being launched in a time-limited pilot program. Visitors will need to download a QR code that may be checked by controllers. Transgressors risk fines starting at 10 times the entrance fee. The city of Como is also considering introducing a similar fare, and many cities right across the world have imposed taxes to limit the number of tourists, and that includes Barcelona and the island of Bali. So to take this on, joining us from Vienna is Claudia Dolezal. She is a professor in tourism and sustainability at the Institute, of Tourism at Krems University. Claudia, welcome. What do you make of this new charge in Venice?
Hello, thank you very much. Well, of course, what we're seeing in Venice is not really surprising here. Venice has been battling over tourism, too much tourism for quite a few years now. Last year, Venice was close to being put on the UNESCO World Heritage list of danger, which means that the city of Venice would be endangered. And of course, what we're also seeing is increasingly more tourists, and on busy days, nearly double the amount of tourists in Venice as we have residents. So the entrance fee that is introduced now is, of course, not surprising after other measures like banning cruise ships. This is not new. Okay. That Venice is trying to do more.
We can see why they're doing it, but how is it likely to go down with tourists, do you think?
Yeah, I think that actually it will not deter tourists to visit Venice in the future, because I don't think that €5 will actually put you off to visit Venice if you've always wanted to visit Venice. But of course, what might happen is that tourists might be more leveled out throughout the year, because of course Venice is asking for this charge only on 29 days a year, which are the busiest days. And so maybe tourists find that too much of a hassle and go on another day. But in the end, I don't think that this will reduce the number of tourists. What it rather does is it actually creates another symbol for showing that Venice is turning a little bit into a theme park. We're really going down the route of Disneyfication here, of charging entrance to a city that is actually someone else's home.
Yeah, in Venice, of course, some residents say that more attention needs to be paid to boosting the resident population and improving services for residents as opposed to focusing on tourism. And it's a fair point, isn't it?
Yeah, of course. And we see this all around the world. Of course, in Venice, it's extreme. And of course, what the government is saying with an entrance fee or with tourism tax is that we are using this for the residents. But I can also understand that residents cannot see the actual changes in their lives when they're trying to take the boat in the morning or when they're trying to have a coffee somewhere. we really need to drastically reduce the amount of tourists. And I think we can only do that by actually reducing overconsumption, reducing access, reducing flights. And there needs to be more drastic measures than this.
Over-tourism is increasing around the world, isn't it? Why is it becoming such a thing?
Well, we've seen various factors that have given rise to this phenomenon, particularly before the COVID pandemic. Factors such as on the supply side, we have all the cheap flights. We have the sharing economy with Airbnb that has exploded. We have new markets traveling that we haven't seen traveling before. But also on the demand side, we see new developments. So with the influence of social media on tourism, we've seen increasingly more people wanting to go to these honeypot sites and actually trying to consume a destination from a perspective that they're taking pictures of it. And this combination has led to a really dangerous mix. And over-tourism has increased immensely over the years, also because governments have not put the residents first, but they've put the tourists first, and they've put the economic income first that tourism brings to destinations, of course.
Claudia Dolezal, thank you.
Thank you.
And that is our show for this week. Do get in touch with us on X, formerly known as Twitter, of course, @NickClark, @AlJazz, and do use the hashtag AJC2C when you do. Or drop us an email. Counterthecost@aljazeera.net is our address. There's more for you online, of course, at aljazeera.com/CDC. That will take you straight to our page, which has loads of individual reports, links, and entire episodes for you to catch up on. So that's it for this edition of Counting the Cost. I'm Nick Clark from the whole team. Thanks for joining us. The news on Al Jazeera is coming right up.